It has been 20 years since September 11th, 2001, when terrorists flew passenger planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, targeting the White House as well. If you're old enough to remember that day, the memory of where you were and what you were doing is likely seared into your memory. But this is not the first traumatic national event in our history. John F. Kennedy's assassination, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the 1929 Wall Street crash are just a few 20th century events that no one who has lived through them ever forgot. And in the 19th century, there was the first presidential assassination in our history. This is Reading Aloud, and I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library. As the Civil War was coming to a close in April of 1865, people in the North were looking forward to a war-free summer for the first time in 5 years. Abraham Lincoln was just beginning his second term as president with the enormous task of reuniting a country still bitterly divided and in mourning for the 750,000 lives lost in the war. On April 14, 1865, President Lincoln planned an evening of laughter and relaxation with his wife Mary at Ford's Theater, at a performance of Our American Cousin, a popular new comedy. The next day, the Washington, D.C. newspaper, The Evening Star, relayed the terrible news. Assassination of the President. Attempted murder of Secretary Seward and sons. Dispatches from Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. First dispatch. War Department, Washington, D.C., April 15th, 1:30 a.m. To Major General John A. Dix, New York. Last evening at 10:30 p.m. at Ford's Theater, the President, while sitting in his private box with Mrs. Lincoln, Miss Harris, and Major Rathbun, was shot by an assassin who suddenly entered the box. He approached behind the President. The assassin then leaped upon the stage, brandishing a large dagger or knife, and made his escape by the rear of the theater. The pistol ball entered the back of the President's head. The wound is mortal. The President has been insensible ever since it was inflicted and is now dying. About the same hour, an assassin, either the same or another, entered Mr. Seward's house and, under pretense of having a prescription, was shown to the Secretary's sick chamber. The Secretary was in bed, a nurse and Miss Seward with him. The assassin immediately rushed to the bed, inflicting 2 or 3 stabs on the throat and 2 in the face. It is hoped the wounds may not be mortal. My apprehension is that they will prove fatal. The nurse alarmed Mr. Frederick Seward, who was in an adjoining room, and hastened to the door of his father's room, where he met the assassin, who inflicted upon him 1 or more dangerous wounds. The recovery of Frederick Seward is doubtful. It is not probable that the President will live through the night. General Grant and wife were advertised to be at the theater this evening, but the latter started to Burlington at 6 o'clock last evening. At a cabinet meeting at which General Grant was present today, the subject of the state of the country and the prospect of a speedy peace was discussed. The President was very cheerful and hopeful, spoke very kindly of General Lee and others of the Confederacy, and the establishment of government in Virginia. All the members of the cabinet, except Mr. Seward, are now in attendance on the President. I have seen Mr. Seward, but he and Frederick were both unconscious. Edward M. Stanton, Secretary of War. Second dispatch. War Department, Washington, D.C., 3 a.m., April 15th. To Lieutenant General Grant. The President still breathes, but is quite insensible, as he has been ever since he was shot. He evidently did not see the person who shot him, but was looking on the stage, as he was approached behind. Mr. Seward has rallied, and it is hoped he may live. Frederick Seward's condition is very critical. The attendant who was present was stabbed through the lungs and is not expected to live. The wounds of Major Seward are not serious. Investigation strongly indicates that J. Wilkes Booth is the assassin of the President. Whether it was the same or a different person that attempted to murder Mr. Seward remains in doubt. Chief Justice Carter is engaged in taking the evidence. Every exertion has been made to prevent the escape of the murderer. His horse has been found on the road near Washington. Edward M. Stanton, Secretary of War. Third Dispatch. War Department, Washington, D.C., 4:10 a.m., April 15th. To Major General Dix, New York. The President continues insensible and is sinking. Secretary Seward remains without change. Frederick Seward's skull is fractured in 2 places, besides a severe cut upon his head. The attendant is still alive, but hopeless. Major Seward's wounds are not dangerous. It is now ascertained with reasonable certainty that 2 assassins were engaged in the horrible crime. Wilkes Booth being the one that shot the President, the other a companion of his whose name is not known, but whose description is so clear that he can hardly escape. It appears from a letter found in Booth's trunk that the murder was planned before the 4th of March, but fell through then because the accomplice backed out until Richmond could be heard from. Booth and his accomplice were at the livery stable at 6 o'clock last evening, and left there with their horses about 10 o'clock, or shortly before that hour. It would seem that they had for several days been seeking their chance, but for some unknown reason it was not carried into effect until last night. One of them has evidently made his way to Baltimore, the other has not yet been traced. Edward M. Stanton, Secretary of War. Fourth Dispatch. Washington, April 15th, 3 p.m. To Major General Dix. Official notice of the death of the late President Abraham Lincoln was given by the heads of the departments this morning to Andrew Johnson, Vice President, upon whom the Constitution devolved the office of President. Mr. Johnson, upon receiving this notice, appeared before the Honorable Salmon P. Chase, Chief Justice of the United States, and took the oath of office as President of the United States, and assumed its duties and functions. At 12 o'clock, the President met the heads of the departments in cabinet meeting at the Treasury Building, and among other business, the following was transacted. First, the arrangements for the funeral of the late President were referred to the several secretaries as far as relates to their respective departments. Second, William Hunter, Esquire, was appointed acting Secretary of State during the disability of Mr. Seward, and his son, Frederick Seward, the Assistant Secretary. Third, the President formally announced that he desires to retain the present secretaries of departments of his cabinet, and they would go on and discharge their respective duties in the same manner as before the deplorable event that had changed the head of the government. All business in the departments is suspended during the day. The surgeons report that the condition of Mr. Seward remains unchanged. He is doing well. No improvement in Mr. Frederick Seward. The murderers have not yet been apprehended. Edward M. Stanton, Secretary of War. In the Washington, D.C. Evening Star Extra, the death of the President. At 22 minutes past 7 o'clock, the President breathed his last, closing his eyes as if falling to sleep, and his countenance assuming an expression of perfect serenity. There were no indications of pain, and it was not known that he was dead until the gradually decreasing respiration ceased altogether. Reverend Dr. Gurley of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, immediately on its being ascertained that life was extinct, knelt by the bedside and offered an impressive prayer, which was responded to by all present. Dr. Gurley then proceeded to the front parlor, where Mrs. Lincoln, Captain Robert Lincoln, Mr. John Hay, the private secretary, and others were waiting, where he again offered prayer for the consolation of the family. Announcements in the Evening Star. The funeral. It is expected, though nothing has been definitely determined upon, that the funeral of the late President Lincoln will take place on or about Thursday next. It is supposed his remains will be temporarily deposited in the Congressional Cemetery. Mr. Seward and Son. Mr. Seward is improving, the wounds on his throat not being of a serious character, and it is hoped and believed he will recover. F. W. Seward, Assistant Secretary of State, is, however, very seriously injured, and his wounds may prove fatal. The other members of the household are not much injured and will recover. Suspension of travel. At 12 o'clock last night, orders were received at the River Transportation Office directing that no vessels be allowed to take their departure. The Alexandria and Washington ferry boats have ceased running for the present. Today, no one is allowed to leave the city by rail, conveyance, or on foot, and the issuing of passes from the headquarters of the Department of Washington has been suspended by General Augur. Advertisement. Ford's new theater, 10th Street, above Pennsylvania Avenue. There will be no performance at this theater tonight. Articles from the Sacramento Bee in Sacramento, California, April 15th, 1865. San Francisco is in tears. Every house is draped in mourning. Business has been suspended. The courts, custom house, post office, and private stores are closed. Extras containing later dispatches are hourly circulated free. The streets are full of men who, with sorrowing faces, discuss the news. The bells on City Hall, various churches, engine houses, and ships are tolling. Ships are clouded in somber shrouds. Men are stunned and know not what to do. It seems as if the great calamity had stopped the current of thought. Bands of music are in the streets playing dead marches and funeral dirges. Nothing is thought of or talked of but the dreadful assassination. The president died at 7:30 and Seward at 9. God be merciful to the assassins, for man cannot. Doubled. On receipt of the news of the assassination of the president, and in order to be prepared for any outbreak which might arise therefrom, the Provost Guard was, today, doubled. Taken in charge. About noon today, a detachment of the Provost Guard arrested and took to the guardhouse Dr. J. S. Cunningham, who was charged with misdemeanors and having said, after the receipt of the news this morning, that Abe Lincoln was a so-and-so and that he and Seward ought to have been killed 3 years ago. The remark was made in Cunningham's drugstore, corner of J and 10th Streets, but the arrest was made at the corner of K and 10th Streets. To the point. Two friends were discussing today in an alley the news received from the East. The conversation, true and philosophical, was to this effect. Sam, that killing of Uncle Abe was a sore thing. It makes me feel very bad. Sam's heart was so full that he could say nothing in response, and the parties separated. Jim felt for his friend, and at a short distance threw out this wholesome dose of consolation. Sam, never mind. They can assassinate the man, but they can't assassinate the cause. There was a good deal of square sense in that remark. Dispatches from around the country, April 15th. Baltimore. Business at the Corn and Stock Exchange is entirely suspended, and the streets are crowded. Indignation is manifested by the crowd on Baltimore Street in regard to the obnoxious pictures displayed by certain photographers conspicuous for their disloyalty. The likeness of Marshall Kane of the 19th of April notoriety was taken down by the crowd from Israel's showcase and thrown into the street and stamped upon by the people. Bondon's photographic gallery was also visited, but the proprietors prudently removed certain obnoxious pictures. It was rumored that this last establishment had on hand a picture of Booth, the assassin who was well known here, this being his native city. This picture, however, was removed before the mob reached the place, where serious consequences might have resulted. The military and police authorities are making every effort to preserve the peace. Nashville. The news of President Lincoln's death reached here as the procession, postponed from yesterday in honor of recent victories, was being formed. When the news was read, the procession broke up, and with arms reversed and with bands playing funeral music, they slowly returned to their camps. Intense horror at the untimely death of the president fills all hearts. Great preparations had been made at the quartermaster's department and other government offices in decorating and illuminating offices and dwellings, which are now shrouded in mourning. Business is entirely suspended, and the streets were thronged with the sad and anxious faces, as the facts of the murder became known. A bitter feeling of retaliation seems to prevail against the rebels and rebel sympathizers. Minute guns are being fired from the capital. Cincinnati. The news of the assassination of President Lincoln produced profound sorrow and great indignation. Business was suspended. Flags were displayed at half-mast, and the whole city is draped in mourning. The streets were thronged all day with sad and mournful faces. Junius Brutus Booth, brother of Wilkes Booth, announced to appear at Pike's Opera House tonight, was compelled to leave the city. All places of amusement are closed tonight. Rumors prevail of several persons having been killed for professions of joy at Lincoln's death, but it is believed that these are false. Boston. The citizens of Boston are overwhelmed with grief at the great calamity which has befallen our common country. All assembled and resolved that an expression of their strong and fervent sympathy be immediately sent to the surviving members of the afflicted families in view of the irreparable loss which they and their countrymen have sustained by this sad event, and also that a message be sent to Andrew Johnson, the constitutional successor of Abraham Lincoln, as President of the United States, of their confidence in his integrity, his patriotism, and his manhood, and of their determination to give him their undivided and unfaltering support, and imploring the blessing of God to guide him with wisdom and virtue, which characterized his lamented predecessor. Edwin Booth has been plunged into the deepest grief by the desperate act of his brother, and it is telling fearfully upon his sensitive nature. Tonight he was to have taken his farewell of the Boston public for a time, but it is said that he has expressed a determination never to appear upon the stage again. Articles from the Rock Island Argus in Rock Island, Illinois, April 15, 1865. We are astounded by the horrible intelligence of the assassination of death of Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, and William H. Seward, Secretary of State of the United States. The few details we have at this writing, 10 a.m. on Saturday, do not enable us to form any correct judgment of this most horrible crime. But whatever may have been the cause, it is an event which all good citizens will most deeply deplore. The loss of these men will be mourned universally throughout the North as a great public calamity. To the people of the South, it will also be an event most deeply deplored, for the reason that they may now fear they cannot so easily be restored to peace and the Union. We can sincerely say that it is the saddest event of the war, and one which the whole community will mourn with unfeigned sorrow. A bold, bad man is now to be president, and we fear that his election may not lead to such pacific and satisfactory results as would the action of the two distinguished statesmen who have been so horribly murdered. P.S. The sad news of the death of Messrs. Lincoln and Seward, we fear, will cause a return to the vindictive policies of Andrew Johnson. From the Louisville Journal, Louisville, Kentucky, Monday, April 17th. The nation is yet in tears over the bier of Abraham Lincoln. On Saturday morning last, the sudden and startling intelligence of his death came like a paralytic stroke to the American people. At 10 o'clock the evening before, in the state box at Ford's Theater in Washington, the chief magistrate of the Union, in the 56th year of his age, was brutally murdered. While the American people were rejoicing over brilliant deeds which had opened the way to the country's unity and peace, the saddest atrocity of modern times was presented to the world, and now shouts of joy have been changed into faltering but deep-toned words of grief. Never has such an act been recorded before. It was the climax of human perfidy. Many a tragic scene had been enacted in Ford's Theater, but the presentation wasn't real. This, however, was a dreadful, heart-rending reality. There were the stealthy steps, the murderous purpose, the deed of blood committed, the furious shout of the assassin, and then his rapid and cowardly flight. Thus was the nation's chief magistrate suddenly stricken with death. How terrible the calamity! Just as the dawning of peace had come, just as the balm was about to be applied to the country's bleeding wounds, and blood in battle should utterly cease, the ruler of the nation, whose heart and brain were devoted to the great work, was stricken down without fear or warning. It is true that our national life can be embodied in no one man, for its deep effulgence spread throughout the land. But Abraham Lincoln, despite the errors of his administration, had become the center of public hope and confidence. Though doubtless wrong in some things, he was known to be honest and true of heart. Starting just 4 years ago from a simple home in Illinois, and unused to the weighty affairs of state, he assumed the chief executive office in the midst of great national peril. His first inauguration occurred while an army of traitors was tearing down the country's flag and swearing to overturn the country itself. The exigency was enough to appall the stoutest heart. The duties he assumed were at once the most delicate and comprehensive ever performed by man. As we have said already, the lamented president may have committed errors in the course of his administration, and, in circumstances so new and perilous, it was natural that he should. But, through all, and notwithstanding all, the popular confidence has constantly sustained him. He braved the storms of state with stern and fearless will. He was the author of new ideas in American politics, and the acknowledged leader of a great party, when, as it seemed, there were complications enough to blind the judgment and discourage the heart of any other man. Rising to eminence from the walks of humble life, he was a marked illustration of the fact that, under our free American government, trappings of wealth or brilliant ancestral lines are not wanted to secure the awards of honor and fame. He may have been a partisan, yet he was magnanimous. He may have often been in error, yet he was always sincere. He called great armies to battle against the South, that rebellion might be suppressed and the blessings of a beneficent government might be restored to a brave but misguided people. After a struggle of 4 long years, he had the proud gratification of witnessing the nation's triumph and inaugurating measures which promised the early restoration of unity and peace to the country. And for days previous to his death, every indication of future events was auspicious of returning harmony throughout the land. Now that Abraham Lincoln is dead, our reverence for his memory and our sincere appreciation of his many illustrious traits cause every partisan sentiment we have felt toward him to sink into oblivion. Even as he, while living, was magnanimous and noble toward private and public foes, so we, in view of his calamitous death, would heartily forgive the past, and remember only that which was good and great in the man. Simultaneously with the death of President Lincoln, and in pursuance of the Constitution, Andrew Johnson became President of the United States. Words are poor indeed to express the deep solicitude now universally felt in view of the new administration. The highest office in the nation has unexpectedly devolved upon President Johnson at a period of solemn and vital importance. His illustrious predecessor, through the most perilous trial, had placed the country where it was enabled with perfect assurance to command the public peace. The attitude of the nation was a proud and glorious one. It is natural, therefore, that the profoundest anxiety should now pervade the land when the executive head of the nation has been changed in a manner so startling and sudden. Mr. Johnson stands in the presence of a mighty nation whose fervent prayers are now ascending to God. They are beseeching blessings for him. It is true that the nation in its life and purpose is unchanged. Its life is enduring, and its purpose is directed unalterably to the great destiny which, through fire and steel if need be, inevitably awaits it. But a feeling prevails that, at a time like this, a change in the executive head must be accompanied by new perils to the nation. We hope that every cause of apprehension will soon be removed from the popular mind. The sense of obligation often gives intellectual and moral elevation to men, and we hope that President Johnson now feels its ennobling influence. The news from Washington, as we are gratified to observe, is highly encouraging. We are assured that the new Chief Magistrate fully appreciates the solemnity and dignity of his great office, and that it is his purpose to pursue the late magnanimous and enlightened policy of the lamented President, who had so largely increased the public faith and hope. We shall always endeavor to be just and liberal toward President Johnson, keeping steadily in our view the perilous exigency he is suddenly called to meet. And let him devote all his powers with singleness of heart to the nation's redemption. We will sustain him as we have sustained his predecessor, approving his course where we can do so consistently with patriotic duty, and disapproving it, kindly but earnestly, where we feel it to be injurious. For the nation's sake, it is the duty of every loyal man thus to extend support and confidence to President Johnson, and so increase his own strength and confidence in the exalted task before him. He is entrusted now with the country's fate, with which our own is inseparably linked. He has brain enough, as it will be freely admitted, to perform the duties of his office with signal ability, and it is now our prayer that heaven may guide him in the light of truth and wisdom. The end. Now, despite the widespread reports of the death of Secretary of State William Seward and his son Frederick, both actually survived. After his recovery, William Seward continued to serve as Secretary of State under Andrew Johnson, and in 1867 negotiated the transfer of Alaska from Russian to American control. William Seward died in 1872. Frederick Seward, William's son, fully recovered from his injuries, serving as Assistant Secretary of State under Andrew Johnson and later under Rutherford B. Hayes. Frederick Seward died at the age of 84 in 1915. John Wilkes Booth escaped to Northern Virginia and was killed there on April 26, 1865. Lewis Powell, who tried to assassinate William Seward, and the other conspirators were quickly rounded up, tried, and sentenced. Powell, along with David Harold, George Azerodt, and Mary Surratt, were hanged on July 7, 1865. Those who were alive when Lincoln was assassinated never forgot where they were when they heard the news. As late as 1956, on the television show I've Got a Secret, Mr. Samuel Seymour's secret was that he witnessed Lincoln's assassination as a young boy attending the play at Ford's Theater. And I have a link to that show right here. Just has been the case with the September 11th attacks. The United States was forever changed by Lincoln's assassination and its aftermath. It just couldn't be otherwise with such an event. But the country carries on. And as it was said about Lincoln's death, Sam, never mind. They can assassinate the man, but they can't assassinate the cause. Thank you and have a good week.